Imagine waking up before sunrise, not to the sound of an alarm, but to the crackling of wood burning in an open hearth at the center of the room. The smell of rice steam fills the air. Outside, beyond the thin paper walls, the fog still clings to the rice fields, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a temple bell marks the beginning of another day. This is Japan, roughly 500 years ago. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. When you think of feudal Japan, what comes to mind first? Samurai? Castles? Perhaps the flash of a katana in battle? Those images are real, yes. But there is an entire world that rarely gets talked about. The world behind closed doors. The homes, the daily architecture of survival, community, and culture that shape the lives of millions of ordinary people who never swung a sword in battle. That's exactly where we're going today. To understand the homes of feudal Japan, we first need to understand the era they were built in. The period we're focusing on is the Sengoku Jidai, which translates quite powerfully as the Age of Warring States. This era spanned roughly from the mid-15th century to the early 17th century, and it was, without exaggeration, one of the most turbulent chapters in Japanese history. The central government, the imperial court, and the traditional shogunate had lost its grip on power. What emerged in its place was a fragmented Japan, a patchwork of territories each controlled by powerful regional warlords known as daimyo. These men commanded armies, taxed populations, and fought constantly for land, resources, and dominance. The names of some of them have survived the centuries with an almost legendary weight: Oda Nobunaga, Takeda Shingen, Uesugi Kenshin. These were not merely generals. They were architects of a world defined by conflict and calculated ambition. But here's what gets overlooked in most tellings of this story. While the daimyo and their samurai armies moved across the landscape like chess pieces, the vast majority of the Japanese population was doing something far less dramatic and far more essential. They were farming. They were fishing. They were building houses, raising children, preparing meals, and trying to hold life together in the middle of an era that offered very little stability. At the time, Japan's social structure was rigid and clearly defined. At the top sat the emperor, symbolic but largely powerless during this period. Just below were the shogun and the daimyo, the true power brokers. Then came the samurai class, warriors bound by codes of loyalty and conduct. Below them were the farmers, the most numerous class and arguably the backbone of the entire economy. After farmers came artisans, those who made things with their hands, and then merchants, who traded goods. At the very bottom were those considered outside the formal social hierarchy altogether. And here is the crucial point that connects all of this to architecture. Where you stood in this hierarchy determined almost everything about how you lived, including the home you were born into, worked in, and died within. The homes of a samurai and the home of a rice farmer existed in the same era, breathed the same mountain air, faced the same seasonal rains, but they were worlds apart in design, scale, and purpose. Understanding both is essential to understanding Japan itself during this extraordinary century. Now, the geography of Japan played a role that cannot be understated. The Japanese archipelago is mountainous, forested, and dramatically shaped by the sea. The climate varies significantly: hot, humid summers in the south, cold, snow-heavy winters in the north. And caught between all of that were 4 distinct seasons, each bringing its own demands. Any home that was going to survive in this environment had to be built with those rhythms in mind. This is something the people of feudal Japan understood instinctively. Their architecture was not an accident or a casual tradition. It was a response, deeply practical, deeply thoughtful, to the land they lived on. There was also something else at work. Japanese culture had, over centuries, developed an aesthetic philosophy that resisted excess. There's a concept woven into the fabric of traditional Japanese thought, a sensitivity toward impermanence, simplicity, and the quiet beauty of things that don't try too hard. You can see it in the tea ceremony, in poetry, in the arrangement of a single branch in a ceramic vase. And you can absolutely see it in the way they built their homes. These were not houses designed to impress through size or ornamentation. They were designed to function, and in that function, to express something true about the people who lived inside them. In the chapters ahead, we'll walk through those homes in detail. We'll look at the materials used to build them, the ingenious design choices that allowed spaces to shift and breathe, the hearth that served as the beating heart of family life, and the ways in which something built from bamboo and clay 5 centuries ago still echoes in Japanese architecture today. But before we step through that doorway, it's worth pausing here, in the fog of a Sengoku morning, with the bell still fading in the distance, and simply acknowledging this. The story of how people lived is just as important as the story of how they fought, maybe more so. Close your eyes for a moment and try to picture a construction site in 16th century rural Japan. There are no cranes, no cement mixers, no prefabricated panels being lifted into place by machinery. What you see instead is a group of men, neighbors, family members, skilled carpenters passing knowledge from father to son, working with their hands, with simple tools, and with materials pulled almost entirely from the land surrounding them. That image tells you everything you need to know about the philosophy behind traditional Japanese architecture. The homes built during the Sengoku period were not the result of industrial thinking. They were the result of intimate knowledge of the forest, the soil, the river, the mountain. Every beam, every wall panel, every bundle of thatch on the roof had a story that began not in a factory, but in nature. And understanding that connection is the key to understanding why these structures looked the way they did, lasted as long as they did, and felt the way they felt to the people who lived inside them. The most common type of home for the rural population during this era was known as a minka, a word that translates simply as house of the people. The minka was not one specific design. It was a broad category that encompassed dozens of regional variations, each adapted to the particular climate, landscape, and cultural traditions of the area where it was built. A minka in the snowy mountains of Gifu looked quite different from one built along the humid coastline of Kyushu. But they all shared the same fundamental logic: use what the land offers, waste nothing, and build something that can endure. So what exactly did they build with? Wood was the primary structural material, and it was chosen with great care. Japanese cedar, known as sugi, and Japanese cypress, hinoki, were the most prized varieties. Both were abundant in Japan's heavily forested mountains, and both had qualities that made them ideal for construction. They were strong, relatively lightweight, resistant to moisture, and, critically, they aged with dignity. A well-cut hinoki beam doesn't simply deteriorate over time. It hardens. It deepens in color. It develops a presence that newer wood simply doesn't have. Carpenters of the period understood this, and they selected their timber accordingly, sometimes letting cut wood dry and cure for years before incorporating it into a structure. The framework of a minka was assembled using a post and beam system, large vertical columns supporting horizontal beams, creating a skeleton that could bear the weight of a heavy roof without requiring solid load-bearing walls. This was a crucial design decision because it meant the walls themselves didn't need to carry structural weight. They could be lighter, thinner, and more flexible, which, as we'll see, opened up extraordinary possibilities for how interior space was organized. Those walls were typically constructed from a combination of materials. Woven bamboo strips formed a kind of internal lattice, a mesh that was then covered on both sides with layers of clay mixed with straw and sand. This technique, sometimes called wattle and daub, had been used across many cultures around the world, but the Japanese version had its own refinements. The layering was done gradually, allowing each coat to dry before the next was applied. The result was a wall that was breathable. It could absorb humidity in the summer and release it, while also providing insulation against the cold. Bamboo itself was one of the most versatile materials available. It grew fast, required no replanting, and could be harvested repeatedly from the same root system. Beyond walls, it was used in flooring supports, ceiling structures, drainage channels, fencing, and countless household objects. In many ways, bamboo was the plastic of feudal Japan, endlessly useful, available almost everywhere, and adaptable to nearly any purpose. Now look upward, because the roof of a traditional minka is perhaps its most dramatic feature. In many regions, particularly in mountainous and rural areas, roofs were constructed from kaya, a type of thick dry grass, also known as miscanthus. These thatched roofs were extraordinarily thick, sometimes reaching a depth of nearly 1 meter at the ridge. That thickness was not decorative, it was functional. A deep thatched roof acted as insulation in winter, keeping warmth inside. In summer, it prevented the sun's heat from penetrating into the living space below. During heavy rains, and Japan receives considerable rainfall, it shed water efficiently, channeling it away from the walls and foundation. Thatching was a skill passed through generations. An experienced thatcher could layer the grass so tightly and uniformly that the roof would last for decades before needing replacement. And when it did need replacing, the work was typically done communally, neighbors helping neighbors in a tradition of collective labor that was deeply embedded in rural Japanese culture. In more urban areas, or in the homes of wealthier farmers and merchants, ceramic roof tiles, kawara, began to appear during this period. These dark gray tiles, fired in kilns and interlocked in precise rows, offered greater durability and fire resistance than thatch. Their visual weight gave the buildings they covered a sense of solidity and permanence that signaled, even from a distance, something about the status of those who lived beneath them. Beneath the roof and the walls, the floor system was equally thoughtful. In the most basic rural homes, part of the floor was simply packed earth, called doma, a hardened area near the entrance that served as a work and cooking space. Shoes were removed here, tools were stored here. In wealthier homes, raised wooden floors covered the rest of the interior, elevating the living space slightly above the ground. This elevation was not merely symbolic. It improved airflow beneath the structure, reducing moisture buildup, discouraging insects, and helping to preserve the wooden framework above. Every single one of these choices, the cedar beams, the clay walls, the thatched roof, the raised floor, was made in response to a specific challenge posed by the environment. There was no waste of effort, no decoration for decoration's sake. The beauty of these homes, and they were genuinely beautiful, emerged not from ornament, but from the precision of their logic. There is something almost quietly radical about that idea. In an era of constant warfare and social instability, ordinary Japanese families were building homes that expressed a profound respect for the natural world, structures that worked with the climate rather than against it, that used local materials rather than importing artificiality, that were designed to be repaired, reused, and renewed. 5 centuries later, architects and designers around the world still study these principles. Sustainability, adaptability, material honesty, these are the concepts that fill contemporary design schools and environmental manifestos. And yet, the farmers and carpenters of Sengoku, Japan, had already figured it out, not through theory, but through generations of lived experience. The bones of these homes were made from the earth, and the earth, it turns out, was more than enough. Step inside. Remove your shoes at the entrance. This is not optional. It is instinct, culture, and respect compressed into a single gesture. The boundary between outside and inside in a traditional Japanese home is not just physical, It is philosophical. The first thing you notice is the floor. Covered in tatami, rectangular mats woven from rice straw and rush grass, the surface beneath your feet is firm but with a faint give, like walking on compressed earth. The smell is clean and faintly grassy. Rooms in these homes were not measured in square meters. They were measured in tatami, a room of 6 mats, a room of 8. The mat was the unit of life. But what truly defines this interior is not what fills it. It is what doesn't. There are no heavy wardrobes, no fixed tables, no beds occupying permanent corners. The space is open, intentionally, beautifully open. During the day, sleeping futons are folded and stored. A low table appears for meals, then disappears. The same room hosts breakfast, receives a guest, and becomes a bedroom by nightfall. This was not poverty of design, it was genius. The walls themselves participate in this flexibility. Sliding doors called shoji, delicate wooden frames covered in translucent rice paper, divide or connect rooms depending on the moment's need. Pull them open, and 2 small rooms become one generous space. Close them, and privacy is restored instantly. Light filters through the paper in a way that is almost liquid, soft, diffused, never harsh. Deeper inside, heavier sliding panels called fusuma mark the boundaries between more formal spaces. Decorated sometimes with painted landscapes or birds rendered in ink, they were not merely functional, they were the art on the walls, and at the center of it all, the irori. A square pit cut into the raised wooden floor, lined with ash and filled with glowing coals, the irori was the heartbeat of the home. Families gathered around it not just for warmth, but for everything. Rice was cooked in iron pots suspended above the flame on an adjustable wooden hook, the jizai-kagi, that could be raised or lowered with a simple pull. The smoke rose slowly through the room, curing the wooden beams above, darkening them over decades into a deep amber black that told the story of every meal ever cooked beneath that roof. There were no chimneys. The smoke found its way out through gaps in the thatch, through the open eaves, through the patient logic of a structure built to breathe. Life happened low to the ground here. Sitting, kneeling, lying, the human body in these spaces was close to the earth, oriented differently than in a world of chairs and elevated surfaces. It demanded a different kind of stillness, a different kind of presence. Near the entrance to many homes, a small wooden shelf called the kamidana, a household shrine, held offerings of rice, salt, and water for the ancestral spirits believed to watch over the family. Religion was not separate from daily life in feudal Japan. It lived inside the walls, breathed in the smoke, and rested quietly on that small shelf beside the door. Outside, but still connected, was the ingawa, a narrow wooden veranda running along the edge of the home, caught between the interior world and the garden beyond. Neither fully inside nor fully outside, the ingawa was a space for sitting in the late afternoon, watching the light change across the garden, listening to rain fall on the stones. It was a place of transition and contemplation, and in a life defined by hard work and uncertainty, those quiet moments mattered enormously. This interior, flexible, minimal, warm, alive, was not accidental. It was the physical expression of values held deeply by the people who inhabited it. Simplicity was not a limitation, it was a choice. Space was not empty, it was potential. Every element inside a traditional Japanese home served multiple purposes, responded to multiple seasons, and asked its inhabitants to remain aware of the time of day, the weather outside, the needs of the moment. To live in such a space was, in a very real sense, to practice a kind of daily mindfulness long before that word existed in any language. Nothing built by human hands lasts forever. The thatched roofs eventually surrendered to weather and time. The clay walls cracked and were patched and cracked again. Fires, And there were many fires in an era of war and open flames, erased entire villages in a single night. Most of the homes we have been walking through today no longer exist in their original form, and yet something survived. Not always in the structures themselves, but in the logic embedded within them, in the proportions, in the materials, in the instinct to remove your shoes at the threshold, to sit close to the ground, to let light enter softly through paper rather than glass. These are not merely habits. They are memories carried forward by a culture that understood, perhaps better than most, that the way you build a home is the way you build a life. Look at Japan today, at the contemporary architecture rising from its cities, at the minimalist interiors filling its design magazines, and you will find the Sengoku farmhouse still whispering beneath the surface, the tatami room preserved in the corner of a modern apartment, the shoji screen interpreted in frosted glass and aluminum, the ingawa reborn as a transitional deck between a living room and a carefully curated garden. These are not nostalgic gestures. They are evidence of something that worked so well, so honestly, that time simply refused to erase it. But before we arrive at the present, let's take one final look at what divided the homes of this era. Because not everyone in feudal Japan lived the same way, and those differences tell us something important. The minka of a rice farmer and the residence of a samurai shared certain architectural DNA. The post and beam structure, the sliding doors, the tatami floors. But the samurai residence, known as a buke-yashiki, inhabited a different scale and carried a different set of obligations. These were not simply larger homes. They were statements of rank, instruments of social function, and in some cases, extensions of military command. A buke-yashiki was typically enclosed behind walls or fencing, signaling separation from the common street. Inside, there were dedicated spaces for receiving guests, formal rooms called zashiki, where the aesthetic choices were deliberate and coded. A hanging scroll in the alcove, called a tokonoma, might display calligraphy or a painted landscape chosen to reflect the season or convey a message to a visiting dignitary. Flower arrangements, ikebana, placed with mathematical precision, communicated refinement, control, and cultural education. Nothing in these spaces was accidental. The gardens of samurai residences were extensions of that same intentionality. Rocks, water, moss, and carefully pruned trees composed landscapes that were designed to be contemplated rather than simply viewed. Walking through such a garden was meant to slow the mind, to remind the samurai, whose life was defined by readiness for violence, that beauty and discipline were not opposites. Contrast that with the farmhouse at the edge of a rice field, where the engawa looked not over a sculpted garden, but over muddy paddies and the tools of daily labor. Both spaces expressed something true. One expressed power and refinement. The other expressed endurance and community. Neither was lesser. Both were honest. There is one more element worth carrying with us as we close this documentary, and that is the profound role of collective construction in feudal Japanese society. These homes were rarely built alone. When a family needed a new roof, the village came together. When a young couple established a new household, neighbors contributed labor and materials. The act of building was simultaneously an act of belonging. The home that emerged from that effort was not just a shelter, it was a physical record of the relationships that made survival possible. That communal spirit, that interweaving of architecture and social bond, is perhaps the most invisible and most enduring legacy of all. 500 years have passed since the carpenters of the Sengoku period selected their timber, mixed their clay, and bundled their thatch. The wars that defined their era have long been settled into history books and museum displays. The daimyo, whose ambitions shook the archipelago, are now names carved into monuments. But somewhere in Japan today, in a restored farmhouse open to visitors on a quiet hillside, or in a traditional inn where guests still sleep on futons and wake to the smell of wood and tatami. Somewhere, the irori still holds its warmth. The shoji still filters the morning light into something soft and golden. And the Engawa still offers that perfect unhurried space between inside and outside, between the life we are living and the world we are simply watching pass. These homes were not built to be remembered. They were built to be lived in, and perhaps that is exactly why we still remember them.